Dr. Sen, let me turn to you. The survey suggests, or the data suggests, that per capita monthly household expenditure has more than doubled in 2022-23 as compared to 2011-12. This has led the NITI Aayog CEO to suggest that poverty in India is now below 5%. Do you go along with this poverty figure, that poverty in India is below 5% now?
The two separate questions there, Raj. The first is whether am I surprised that the monthly per capita expenditure has gone up by 100%? And the answer is no, because what it suggests is inflation adjusted. That's only about 3 to 3.5% increase in consumption expenditure per year. Now, for an economy that's growing at least 6.5%, that is not a surprising figure at all, right? That's number one. The second is the question on poverty. The fact of the matter is that this particular data set is significantly different in the way the data has been generated from the surveys that we used to do earlier. And it is not yet apparent to me that the old poverty line can be used to calculate poverty from this data. We may have to revisit the poverty line in its entirety. But that's a call that I will, and most of us who are in this particular line of work, we will not be able to take this call until the unit level records are made available.
So effectively, you are skeptical about this 5% figure, that only 5% of Indians are now below the poverty line. Based on this consumption expenditure survey, you believe that would not be accurate, that it would be inaccurate to suggest that only 5% of Indians are below the poverty line. Am I correct?
No, I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying that categorically. I'm saying that given that there's been a significant change in methodology, applying the old poverty line to this data would not be appropriate until we've done a little more detailed work.
But would you be willing to accept that many more Indians have been lifted out of poverty in the last decade, indeed, dare I say, over the last 2 decades, than the previous 2 decades?
Almost certainly, yes, right? Now, I don't think that is the issue. The real question is the extent to which it has happened. And that depends upon the consistency between the consumption data and the poverty line, right? And on that, I cannot be categoric.
Okay, so your question, you are raising more questions over the nature of the poverty line and whether we need to revisit that entire issue of how do we decide on the poverty line. Am I correct?
This is correct.
Okay, let me take that then to you, Dr. Bhalla. Dr. Bhalla, you among others have been pushing the idea that millions of people have been lifted above poverty. You heard what was just said by Dr. Sen. He is suggesting that we need to be a little cautious, if I may use the word, before we suggest that only 5% of Indians are now below the poverty line if we go by this consumption expenditure survey.
Yeah, let me add a few observations to what Dr. Sen has already said. First, that actually, and what you are saying, given the poverty line that we have, the Tendulkar poverty line or the World Bank 1.9 poverty line, the poverty figures in India today, according to the HCES 22-23, is about 2%, not 5% or higher. 2%. Second, where I happen to agree with Dr. Sen is that we need to revisit the poverty line and raise it substantially upwards. I don't know whether he meant that we should, the methodology of calculating poverty has not changed from the 2011-12 survey. There's nothing at all that is different from this than earlier surveys, because we now have the same definition of poverty, which is the modified mixed recall method. Second, that the reason you want to raise the poverty line, and this is something that I've argued at least for the last decade and a half, is that when your incomes rise, when your per capita consumption rises, as it has done in India, and especially in the last 10 years, you need to raise the poverty line, because around the world, poverty lines become relative. It's no longer absolute. The absolute poverty line, the extreme poverty line of 1.9 or the Tendulkar poverty line is obsolete, because it's no longer suitable to the Indian conditions. By conditions, I mean the progress all Indians have made, especially those below the poverty line and the bottom 50% as well, that we need to raise the poverty line.